I bought cruise tickets for my parents so we could spend quality time together, something I had longed for since they never paid much attention to me growing up. I planned to surprise them at dinner, but they left me waiting at the restaurant for 2 hours, completely indifferent to my plans while they shopped for a gift for my golden child brother's birthday, an event that wasn't even happening for another 2 weeks. Afterward, when I posted photos from my cruise vacation on Facebook, I was suddenly labeled the selfish, ungrateful child. I want to make something absolutely clear. I have never been the favorite child in my family. This isn't some exaggerated belief I've come up with in my mind. This is a very real and consistent experience I've had throughout my life. Growing up, my parents didn't hide the fact that my younger brother was their priority. To give some context, my mother got pregnant with my brother just a year after I was born. It wasn't a planned pregnancy, but my parents were still excited about expanding our family. However, that excitement quickly turned to anxiety when doctors ran tests and discovered serious health issues with the baby. These were not small concerns, but enough for my parents to be faced with the heartbreaking decision of whether or not to terminate the pregnancy. It was a tough time, but they ultimately decided to go ahead with the pregnancy, fully aware of the challenges that lay ahead. When my brother Jackson was born, my parents' fears were confirmed. He had severe heart defects that required immediate and extensive surgery. My parents were devastated. Jackson spent a lot of time in the hospital, and his health became the central focus of our family. This naturally shifted everything in our lives, and I felt the impact of that shift in how I was treated. My parents' fear, love, and guilt over Jackson's condition consumed them, and while I know they were doing their best, it meant that, in many ways, I was pushed aside. During the time Jackson was in the hospital, I stayed with my grandparents because my parents were too focused on his medical needs to look after me. They rarely visited me, and as much as I tried not to hold this against them, it was hard. Even as a young child, I understood that my brother's health came first, and I tried to be understanding. Luckily, my grandparents made up for what was lacking at home. They were warm and attentive, offering me the care and support that my parents couldn't at the time. Every morning, my grandmother would make me breakfast, and we'd spend time baking or gardening together. My grandfather would take me to the park or read me stories. They filled the void left by my parents' absence, almost becoming a second set of parents to me. Eventually, Jackson's health improved, and my parents were able to bring him home from the hospital. You'd think that this would have been the moment they'd come for me, right? That they'd want to reunite the family and bring me back too. But no, that wasn't the case. My mom, still overwhelmed by the stress of Jackson's recovery and exhausted from managing a sick child, decided she wasn't ready to take on the responsibility of 2 kids. She told my grandparents they would need to continue caring for me for a little while longer. My dad, swamped with work and trying to handle the financial burden of Jackson's medical bills, didn't offer much help either. My grandparents, who genuinely loved having me around, didn't protest. They were happy to keep me with them. While I did feel some sadness knowing I wasn't going back home, I wasn't completely devastated. I still felt loved, and that comforted me. The real trouble, though, began when years passed, and my parents showed no signs of bringing me back home. What was meant to be a temporary arrangement had stretched on indefinitely. I only got to see them every other weekend, and even that wasn't guaranteed. Sometimes my dad was too busy with work, and other times, they simply didn't make the effort to visit. It became the norm that my grandparents were my primary caregivers, while my parents became more like occasional visitors in my life, rather than active participants in it. When I started school, it was my grandparents who took care of everything. They dropped me off in the morning, picked me up in the afternoon, and were there from the moment I woke up until they tucked me into bed at night. They made sure I had all my school supplies, helped with my homework, and ensured that my parents, on the other hand, never checked in. It didn't matter to them whether I went to school every day or how I was doing academically. If I got sick, it was my grandparents who cared for me. It felt like my parents had completely passed on their responsibilities to them. When my parents did come to visit, the conversations always revolved around Jackson. They'd talk endlessly to my grandparents about how wonderful Jackson was as a son, how brave he was in recovering from his surgeries, and how much progress he was making. I don't think they ever once asked my grandparents about me, how I was doing, what was going on in my life, or how I was feeling. I started to feel completely invisible. I can't even recall a single moment when my parents and I spent time together, just the 3 of us. There was no one-on-one time, no effort to rebuild any bond with me. Everything always revolved around Jackson. Then came the moment that I'll never forget, Jackson's birthday party. My parents threw an elaborate celebration for him since he was doing so well. They invited friends, family, neighbors, everyone. My grandparents took me along with them. Throughout the party, I couldn't shake the feeling of jealousy gnawing at me. Watching Jackson be so happy, with my parents showering him with attention, the whole event seemed to be about him. While I knew it was his special day, I couldn't help but feel completely invisible. Here I was, a child too, but all the attention and love I longed for was being directed toward my brother. I'm not sure when it happened, but the overwhelming emotions of watching my parents fawn over my younger brother finally bubbled over. Before I knew it, I burst into tears in front of everyone. I remember feeling so ashamed, knowing that everyone could see me falling apart. My grandparents, bless them, quickly took me to another room, trying their best to comfort me, but the sadness and jealousy were too much. I think some of the guests noticed as well and tried to offer kind words, but nothing really made me feel better. It wasn't about the presents or the party. It was about the attention and love I was desperately craving, and seeing my parents shower it all on Jackson was simply too much to bear. Later, after the birthday party, my parents and grandparents had a huge fight. Apparently, my parents were deeply embarrassed by my emotional outburst. They thought it was childish of me to cry in front of everyone, and in their eyes, my behavior had drawn unnecessary attention to them. It wasn't just about me being upset. It had prompted people to start questioning my living situation. Guests had begun asking why I was never at home with my parents, why I was being raised by my grandparents, and whether my parents were neglecting me. My parents were angry that this scrutiny had been directed at them, and they saw my crying as the thing that had triggered everything. After the argument, a decision was made. I would move back home to live with my parents. This was something I had wanted for years, and yet when it finally happened, I didn't feel the excitement I had always imagined. Instead, I was filled with a deep sense of apprehension. The first few days back home were painfully awkward. The house felt alien to me, and I constantly felt out of place, like I was intruding on a space that no longer belonged to me. My parents had their own routines, centered entirely around Jackson's needs and schedule. They barely acknowledged me, and when they did, it was only in passing. I had hoped that moving back home would finally mean they would notice me, that they would care about me the way they did Jackson. But it quickly became clear that nothing had changed. Jackson was still the center of their world, and I remained on the periphery, ignored and forgotten. The only thing I was grateful for was that I had my own room. I spent most of my time there when I wasn't at school. It wasn't because I enjoyed being alone, but because being around my parents made me feel more invisible than when I was away from them. At least in my room, I didn't have to witness the constant affection they showered on Jackson while I sat there unnoticed. I would stay there for hours, doing my homework or just lying on my bed, trying to make sense of it all. Throughout my entire school life, my parents never once showed any interest in my education or accomplishments. Not once did they ask about my homework, and they never attended any of my award ceremonies. Even when I participated in school plays or extracurricular activities, they simply couldn't be bothered to show up or acknowledge that I was involved in anything. It felt like nothing I did mattered to them. Despite their complete disregard for my achievements, I made sure to excel in school. The few times my grandparents tried to remind my parents of my successes, it was met with either silence or outright dismissal. They would encourage my parents to show some appreciation or at least a little pride in me, but my parents would either ignore the comments or scoff, as if my achievements were of no importance. It was painful to see how little they cared. What made it even worse was how they treated Jackson. Jackson had never performed well academically. He struggled in school, often got into trouble, and brought home poor grades. There were times when his teachers even called to discuss his behavior, but none of that seemed to bother my parents. They never held him accountable for his lack of effort, and they certainly didn't discipline him. If he ever managed to do even remotely average on a test or achieve something small, my parents would treat it like a monumental accomplishment. They would order pizza or take us out to his favorite restaurant, turning it into a big family celebration. When I finally graduated high school and got accepted into college, I was lucky enough to earn a partial scholarship. Even though it covered some of the costs, I was still worried about how I would manage the remaining expenses. I asked my parents if they had set up any kind of college fund for me. Part of me already knew the answer, but I had to ask. As expected, They immediately informed me that all the money they had saved was for Jackson. They said he was the youngest and that he would need more help in the future. My father bluntly told me that, as the oldest, I should learn to take care of myself. He did offer to help me apply for an education loan, which I would then have to repay after I got a job. It was incredibly painful to hear that my own parents still didn't prioritize me. While other parents are excited and proud to help their children start their journey into adulthood, mine were basically telling me I was on my own. Thankfully, my grandparents had seen this coming long before I did, and they had been quietly planning for my future. They had set up a trust fund for me in secret years ago. When they finally revealed this to me and told me I never had to worry about college, I was in complete shock. I couldn't believe that someone had cared enough to do something like this for me. I cried tears of joy because, for the first time, I felt truly supported. It felt surreal. No one had ever gone out of their way to look out for me in this way. And here were my grandparents, who not only saw my potential, but had taken steps to ensure I could attend college without the financial burden. But when my parents found out about the trust fund my grandparents had set up for me, they didn't share in my joy or relief. Instead of being happy for me, they immediately turned the conversation toward Jackson. Their first response was to ask my grandparents if they had also set up a trust fund for him. My grandfather calmly explained that they had decided to take care of me specifically because my parents had always prioritized Jackson, and they had seen for years how I had been overlooked. They wanted to make sure I had the same opportunities to succeed without being held back. Of course, this didn't sit well with my parents. They saw it as unfair and immediately started a heated argument with my grandparents about how both grandchildren should be treated equally. They accused my grandparents of playing favorites and insisted that Jackson deserved their money too, simply because he was the youngest in the family. They couldn't accept that my grandparents had chosen to help me because they recognized how neglected I had been all these years. It was like my parents were blind to the fact that they had already spent Jackson's entire life treating him like the center of the universe. Despite the pressure and accusations, my grandparents stood their ground. They didn't back down or let my parents manipulate the situation. They explained that this wasn't about favoritism. It was about ensuring that I had the same opportunities that Jackson had always been given by my parents. My grandparents had made their decision out of love and fairness because they knew I hadn't been given the same attention and support that Jackson had always received. Seeing that they couldn't sway my grandparents, my parents then turned their efforts toward me. They tried to guilt me into sharing some of the trust fund with them, insisting that I should invest in Jackson's future when it came time for him to go to college. They framed it as if I were being selfish by keeping the money for myself, even though it wasn't my money to give away. It was my grandparents' gift to me. I refused. I told them that it wasn't my responsibility to provide for Jackson's education, especially when they had already made it clear that their financial priorities had always been with him. My parents were furious with my decision, but there was nothing they could do. For once, they didn't have the upper hand. I wasn't going to give away something that had been given to me out of love and care just because they believed Jackson deserved everything. It was a painful moment, realizing that even in this, my parents couldn't be happy for me. But it was also empowering because I finally understood that I had to stand up for myself, even if it meant going against my parents. As a result, after I left for college, my relationship with my parents became virtually non-existent. They stopped almost all communication with me, still holding on to the belief that what I did was selfish towards Jackson. Jackson and I had never been close. He was comfortable being the favored child, and with me out of the house, he didn't have to compete for our parents' attention. He never once called to check in or visited me, which wasn't surprising, but it still hurt. The only people who truly cared and remained in my life were my grandparents. They were my emotional support, the ones who always checked in on me, encouraging me, and making sure I didn't feel entirely abandoned. Then, during my third year of college, my world was turned upside down. My grandfather passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack in his sleep. His death shattered me. It was, without a doubt, the darkest time of my life. I stayed with my grandmother for several days as we both grieved together. It was an unimaginable loss for both of us. My grandfather had been a father figure to me in every way that mattered, and losing him left a huge void in my heart. During this painful time, something unexpected happened. I reconnected with my parents and Jackson. We were all shaken by my grandfather's death, and for the first time in years, We found ourselves bonding over our shared grief. Even though I had so many unresolved feelings toward my parents, there was something about the situation that brought us a little closer. It felt like, for a brief moment, the walls between us had come down. At first, I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they were caught in traffic or just running a little late. But after 15, 20, then 30 minutes had passed, I started to get nervous. I called them multiple times, and it wasn't until my fifth attempt that they finally answered. My dad casually mentioned they were finishing up some last-minute errands, as if it was no big deal, and said they'd be reaching the restaurant soon. Annoyed but still hopeful, I stayed at the table, waiting for them to arrive. The server kept coming by, asking if the rest of my party had arrived, and I felt more embarrassed with each passing minute. I didn't want to look like someone who'd been stood up at a nice restaurant. Eventually, I ordered food for myself since I was hungry. I finished my meal, still sitting alone, staring at the empty seats across from me. My calls to my parents went unanswered after that. An hour passed, then nearly two. Finally, after my 15th attempt, my dad picked up the phone. He started apologizing, but at that point, I was beyond frustrated. I yelled at him, asking what they had been doing all this time and why they couldn't have just told me if they weren't coming. "Oh, just stop complaining," he said dismissively. "I'm sorry we're late, but your mother and I got held up at the shop. We found the perfect birthday gift for your brother, but when we got to the counter, we realized your mother had left her card at home. We had to drive back to get it. Thankfully, the shop held our gift, and we were able to buy it just now. Jackson is going to love what we picked out for him. By the way, have you bought anything for your brother yet? You do remember his birthday is in 2 weeks, right?" In that moment, I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. Here I was, trying to share a special moment with my parents to celebrate my achievements and bring us closer. But once again, Jackson was the only thing that mattered to them. They had spent the entire evening shopping for his birthday gift while I was left sitting alone at the restaurant. Not only had they missed the dinner, but they had the nerve to ask if I had remembered to buy something for Jackson. I was seething with anger, but I tried to stay calm as I told my dad that they could have shopped for Jackson any other day. They should have respected my time, especially knowing that this was something I had gone out of my way to plan for them. My dad's response only made things worse. He brushed off my concerns, saying they were on their way now, and that we could talk about it when they got there. But I didn't want to stay any longer. I was too angry. I paid my check, stood up, and left. On my way home, my phone started buzzing. My parents were calling, leaving voicemail after voicemail, saying they had finally arrived and couldn't find me anywhere. I ignored their calls, feeling too hurt and furious to talk to them. Later that night, my mom sent me a series of messages. Instead of apologizing or acknowledging that they had messed up, she turned on me. She called me rude for not being there when they finally arrived, as if I were the one who had wasted their time. She had the audacity to say that this was why they didn't care about my irrelevant plans in the first place, claiming that I was always so hot-headed. She went on to justify their actions, saying that shopping for Jackson was more important because his gift needed to be bought. According to her, their priorities were completely justified, and I was the one at fault for getting angry at them. Reading her messages, I felt a wave of hurt and anger rush through me again. I had poured my heart into planning something special, and all I got in return was the same disregard I had always felt. I just couldn't keep dealing with their hurtful words and their constant dismissal of my feelings. After everything I had done to make that moment meaningful, I was left feeling more alone than ever, realizing that no matter what I did, Jackson would always come first, and I would always be an afterthought. I blocked her without bothering to reply. Update 1. The reason I bought the cruise tickets in the first place was because my parents had shown some significant changes in their behavior after my grandpa's death. I thought they finally saw me as their child and a human being, but I guess I was wrong again. I'm glad my eyes are open now, and from today onwards, I'm done trying to get their attention. I will be blocking both of them on my phone now. Update. It seems my parents have filled Jackson in on the entire incident, and he called me this week to discuss everything. My brother believes that what our parents did wasn't wrong and that I should have respected them enough to wait for their arrival instead of leaving. He mentioned how disappointed our parents were in me and how they reached out to him to complain about my actions. He then asked me to attend his upcoming birthday party so I could apologize to our parents. I declined his invitation and asked him to leave me alone for now. He tried to argue further, But I firmly reminded him that my relationship with our parents had nothing to do with him, and he would never understand what I was going through. Update 2. It's been a month since my last update, and for everyone asking, I did consider canceling my cruise tickets. But then I realized I had spent a significant part of my paycheck on them, so I figured I should make better use of it. I decided to take my best friend and my grandma on the trip instead of my parents. To say the three of us had an amazing time would be an understatement. I had the best time and almost forgot about all the drama with my parents. It was a well-deserved break for all of us. However, after the trip, I posted a few pictures from the cruise, and that's when my dad started sending me messages on Facebook. He called me selfish and ungrateful for taking grandma on the trip and not inviting them. I had forgotten to block my parents on Facebook, thinking they hardly ever used it. The audacity of my dad to expect me to take him after everything he and mom had put me through. He also mentioned how sad mom was after I blocked her and that he wished I would go to therapy and get over my childish behavior so I could stop punishing them for the rest of my life. Update 3. Hi everyone, it's been 4 months since my last update, and I'm doing well. I've blocked both my parents and Jackson. I'll admit, since cutting them off, my life feels so much more peaceful. I've come to accept that sometimes family isn't who you're born into, but who you choose.